Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community.
Good morning and welcome to Money Sense. I'm your host, Neville Hicks, alongside co-host Christophe Barnett.
Good morning.
And Emil Kalinowski.
Pleasure to be here again.
Did I get that right, Emil?
Perfect.
Okay, great. And in studio, I might as well call her a co-host, welcoming back Georgie Loxton.
Thanks, Neville. Great to be here as always.
So we've decided to take a step back, if you will, and look at the more basic side of financial literacy. And this is backed by a lot of listeners and certainly some questions that have been raised. So rather than a traditional kind of question and answer session, we're going to do a series of topics on financial literacy where it's more going to be a roundtable discussion. So this type of form is relatively new and different. So we're gonna kind of open it up here. And we're fortunate because the CFA Society in Montreal actually took it upon themselves to put together an investor guide where investors or people who are interested in financial literacy or learning more about certain aspects of finance can refer to more non-biased literature where they can learn and they're not impacted by people who are either trying to sell product or push their own agenda. So with that, you can actually go, if you Google search, you can bring up these investor guides. And if you type in Google, it's CFA Cayman Investor Guide, and that will come up. Is that right, Christophe?
That's right.
So do that. And they're, we're not preaching them to the T, but we're certainly saying they're a good base to
good starting point. Yeah.
Good starting point. So we're going to cover a couple different topics today, the power of time and return, impact of fees, impact of inflation, and diversification and risk. Now, it sounds like a lot, so we'll see kind of where we're going. I think with that, so kicking off, I guess in investing, it's all about returns.
Yeah.
So if we start at the very basic, well, why do we invest? And talking about these returns, Christophe, as far as compounding goes.
So we've all heard of compounding, and in years past we used to earn some interest in the bank, but in the end, when you make an investment, you want a return. Now, the power of these returns, and we always say invest for the long term, the power of these returns come from compounding. And if I can just give a very basic example, if you make a 10% return on your $100, that's $10. Everyone's okay with that. But what's important is that in the second year, you not only make another $10 on your $100, you make another $1 on that $10 of interest. So the interest earns interest, or the returns earn returns. Now, without getting bogged down in the numbers, if we use our imagination and think if we replicate this process year on year, those returns can grow. And this is very powerful. So the first guide covers this topic, and it has to do with over the course of 10, 20, 30 years, which is our investment lifetime, right? Mm-hmm. We start working in our 20s and hopefully can retire in 30, 40 years maybe. So I guess that's it at its most basic. The time multiplies these returns. And again, don't want to get too bogged down into the numbers, but the higher the return, the larger this compounding effect.
So I was just going to chime in with one little thing there, in that you say use your imagination, and I think that's really hard for people because the power of compounding is so hard to compute in your brain. Our brains can't do it. None of our brains can sit here and compound. You need a calculator, right? Yeah. So for the average person trying to think about that, they can't in their wildest dreams imagine how much money they could have in 20 or 30 years if they invested. Mm-hmm. So I think that actually is a really strong barrier to people investing, is that they can't actually compute compounding, so they massively underappreciate its power. Mm-hmm. And I always tell people it's magical. Like, it's the most magical thing you can ever do. Invest your money and see it compound by 7, 8, 9, 10% every year, but we can't compute it in our brains.
Well, let's give some round numbers.
Let's give
some round numbers to help with our imagination. Yeah. So, again, You can run these all in the calculator if you want, but I'll just give some round numbers and give you the dramatic differences. So if we have a 3% return and we're investing for 10 years, your $10,000 will go to about $12,000. If we leave that for 30 years, instead of $12,000, we have $50,000. That's 4 times. The same 3% a year.
And just 3% return.
3% a year return, 10 years versus 30 years. If we had 6% return, that 10 years would be 14,000, and at 30 years, over 80,000. So 14 to 80,000. So I guess that's the point you were trying to make in terms of that gap.
Absolutely. And I think the
same
other
return,
thing,
same return.
And that's just having a sum of money and leaving it, not adding to it
that
along
was no
the way,
extra investment.
Right? Yeah, and that's when the real power comes. And that's another thing that people massively underappreciate is the power of taking small steps consistently. A little bit of money added, every month or, every week or however you want to do it. That can have a huge return over the long term. And there's a great book I always recommend people to read by David Back. He was the guy that coined the term the latte factor. And he talks about, people saying, but I don't have any money to invest. Well, if you didn't buy that one coffee every day and invested that money instead for 30 years, you could end up with $1 million. And that's really powerful.
Would it be fair to say that you want to pay yourself first?
Right. That's exactly his principle. Pay yourself first. Yeah. Before paying everybody else, the utility bill, pay yourself.
I think it comes down to ultimately saving, right? Paying yourself and almost sacrificing that short term, which is so difficult in
hard.
today's world.
You know what I like to suggest is I don't like budgets because they're like a diet, right? Hard to stick to. But instead of a budget, just for a week, start with a week, maybe if a month if you can, just have a notebook, write down everything you spend. Not because you think, I'm going to judge myself, but just so that you can look back in a month and say, what did I spend and what was important to me? What actually gave me joy? And so when you look through that and said, okay, well, I want to keep all these things that I really like, and is there something that would give me more joy? Or would I like to be a millionaire, like Emile said? Because with this regular investing and starting early, there's the power of compounding matters there too, because there's a difference if you invest for 30 years or wait 10 years and start investing for that next 20 years. It's the same 30-year period, but if you miss that first 10 years of investing, you have to contribute much more to get to that $1 million target or whatever your target is.
And I think that's a really good point because over the longer term, the return you get really matters, like you've shown over the 30-year period, right? Whatever the figures were, you got up to $80,000. But over a 10-year period, the return matters a lot less because compounding hasn't had its time to work its magic. So if you have left it till later in life, the most important thing is your savings rate. More than the rate of return. So if you're in your 50s and you realize I've got 10 years left, you can still do a lot. But the most important thing is going to be how much you save as opposed to the return that you get over that shorter time period.
I'd really like to underline what we're talking about here. Is Neville, when you handed off the baton at the very beginning of our conversation to Christophe, you said it's all about returns. Fair, but I think what we're all also saying is that time and return are the two primary determinants of wealth. And perhaps, as you just said right now, in any 1 year, return, but time is the key.
I think it's that, and I think it's taking it even a step further is you can only have a return if you save. Right? I mean, you in its most basic form, if you don't save money and you don't invest money, your return is zero, and compounding is completely irrelevant. So the first decision that anyone has to make is they need to be committed to making saving and investing a part of their life.
And it's habit.
It's
like
habit,
exercise and healthy eating and all the other habits, good habits.
All the good habits.
Yeah, the good habits,
So step 1, pay yourself first.
Yeah.
Step 2, start as early as you can. Get time on your side. And then it's about returns.
Yeah.
And
it's
that
about
impact
starting.
And tune into a future episode on how to get those returns.
Yeah, and
exactly.
the saving is such a massive issue for us humans, right? It's a deep it goes really deep into our psychology, because we're actually, there's a couple of things we've got to do. We've got to see our future self, which we find hard actually to imagine our future self. We don't have any particular affinity with our future self, and we have to say no to something today so that we can say yes to it later, and that's delayed gratification. And again, that's something that us humans find really hard.
So, Georgie, when what do you find when you're speaking to people as far as what resonates and what is that aha moment where they go, wow, I really have to make this part of my life?
Yeah.
Is it when you show them what you could achieve? Or I'm trying to,
I think, I find for everybody there's always a trigger in their lives that makes them suddenly realize that they've got to either save or invest or do something. It can be turning a certain age. Often it's a decade. People turn 30, 40 or 50, and that's a trigger. Maybe it's having a baby, maybe it's a marriage, maybe it's a death, maybe it's a divorce. There are those kind of life triggers. But otherwise, I think it's about getting to something, as I said, a little bit deeper around why am I doing this? Like, what is it I actually want to achieve? What kind of life do I want to have? And once you start focusing on that and your values, like you said about your values earlier, Christoph, then saving money becomes inspiring. Right, and that's the key. Not a chore. It becomes inspiring, and you're motivated to do it. Just like, I always say, think about your garden. If you're a gardener, right, what motivates you to get up and spend your Saturday pruning your plants and watering it? It's your vision around how you want your garden to look that motivates you. If you don't have that vision around your money, you're not going to wake up in the morning and think, hey, today's the day. I'm so excited about updating my budget spreadsheet and tracking my spending, because that is just not fun. Right? But if you can say, I'm really excited about doing this because I know that in 20 years or in 10 years or in 5 years, I'm going to quit my job, I'm going to travel around the world, I'm going to start learning to paint in Tuscany, or I'm going to go back to school, or I'm going to have enough money to put my kids through education. That's the most important thing to me. If you start with that vision, then it becomes inspiring.
I think that's a great point. The goal isn't to keep a spreadsheet or to keep a budget or to save. The goal is beyond that.
Absolutely.
And so I think, like, if you see your kid growing, then oh wow, right? This is the goal, to provide for them, right? That's so much more meaningful than when you say, oh, I'm going to save and pay myself. Well, no, I'm going to invest in the future of my life, which is my kid here, right?
We're getting very philosophical.
Sorry, that's
me.
No.
This is great.
Well, this is what it takes, right?
Well, I think it's how do you inspire people? What is important? What is fundamentally important that you will change your habits, which habits are very hard to change and break.
Yeah.
So I guess switching gears kind of a bit, one of the next topics in these investor guides, we talk about fees. And I think leading on to fees is a bigger ultimate question that most investors have when they decide to invest is, who do you do it through? Who can you trust? The finance industry has got more transparent. It still is flawed in certainly certain areas. But when we talk about fees or certainly the impact of fees, what's something to keep in mind when investors are looking at various products or instruments or advisors?
Well, the first thing to remember is that fees aren't a bad thing, right? Just fees are the cost. When you hire a lawyer or hire a doctor, you expect to pay for a professional, right? And so you have to think, how much would it cost me to do it? Well, for me to learn to be a surgeon, that's going to cost me a lot. So I'd rather pay someone who's already done it. So that's a good starting place. So the fee has to be reasonable. So don't just say, oh, I balk at any fee.
Yeah.
So that's the first step. But what is reasonable, right? It also depends on the size of your portfolio. And so I think, and lots of fees are hidden.
Yeah,
certainly. Yeah. And well, before we get into this, because this is a good topic and something that I think a lot of people don't like to talk about. So stay with us. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
This is
Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community. Brought to you by the CFA Society Cayman Islands and sponsored by OneTradeX.
And now, more Money Sense.
Good morning and welcome back to Money Sense. I'm your host, Neville Hicks, alongside Christoph Barnett, Emil Kalinowski, and Georgie Loxton. We were just kicking off about fees and the impact of fees in various investment products and advisory fees. And Christoph made a great point about the fact that fees have come down, and it's reasonable to expect to pay for fees, and with that, Georgie made a good point, or was starting into a point, and I cut her off. So let's continue with that.
It's such an interesting topic because the investment industry has come so far in the last decade or so with the with robo advisors and ETFs, and you can effectively go out and invest pretty much for free nowadays. If you were a do-it-yourselfer and you decided you were going to invest your own money, you can buy some ETF funds that are charging 0.1%,
4 basis points.
And you can do it effectively for free. But the thing that's going to matter to your wealth in the long run is your total return. And your total return is dictated more than anything by your own behavior, right? So you can invest for free, but if your behavior is getting in your way along, throughout those decades, which it is going to, because human nature is a horrible investor, right? Human nature is a failed investor. We have
fear and greed.
We have to fear and greed. We have to get over our human naturedness in order to be a good investor. And for most people, that's really, really hard because people want to pile in the top of the market with the greed and they want to panic at the bottom. And if you do that over your investing lifetime, even though your fees might be zero, your total return is going to be negligible.
Right, because you have that your
behavior
gap or the issues surrounding.
So you're implying that they need a coach, a guide, a counselor, someone who's not involved emotionally.
Exactly.
And
take
could
out the
provide
emotion.
feedback.
Absolutely.
Is that right?
Yeah. Take out that you need. I think most people, I'm not going to say everyone, but I think the vast majority of people need exactly that coach, that person who's going to effectively just stand between them and that big mistake, whatever that big mistake's going to be, whether it's going to be piling in the top, panicking at the bottom. I mean, if people really think that back in 2007, 2008, they could have watched let's say they had $1 million portfolio, they were close to retirement, could they have watched that fall 50% and do nothing? Right? Or were they going to panic somewhere near the bottom? If they panicked somewhere near the bottom, their whole plan went to pot, right? Because the market's up, 4 times since then? Doubled. What was it? We hit the low of 600. Yeah, we're up about 4 times, aren't we, since the
Many
low?
times.
Yeah.
More
but
than
if you
enough.
got out at the bottom and you've never got back in, right? You would have been so much better off paying somebody 1% or even 1.5%, right? To manage that money for you and keep you in the market.
And I don't want to go off too topic of the fees, but I think, I'd like to underline that point that you said. It was a beautiful one regarding that it's human nature to not be good at investing, to panic at the wrong moment, to be all in at the wrong moment. We seem to do the opposite. When something's on sale at the store, we know when it's time to buy. But when something's on sale in the financial market, we sell, and it doesn't seem to make sense. I just wanted to underline that we're fighting our nature.
Always, yeah.
But let's talk about the numbers. So let's say we have 2 advisors, one that charges 2% and one that charges 1% for the same valuable function that we just discussed. Now, remember back in the first half of the show when we talked about that 10,000 that became 80,000? Well, if we had a 2% fee on that ending value got cut to 60,000. So 20,000 out of the 80,000 went to fees. That's a quarter of the total portfolio. And you thought, 2% doesn't sound a lot. But again, we use our imagination. That 2% fee compounds as well because that's 2% that's not there again that first year. Then the second year, another 2%. And that gap keeps growing because the 2% also compounds. A 1% fee, not so bad. Instead of the 80,000, you're up to 70,000. Right? So again, these are valuable. So you pay 10,000 essentially to earn the 70,000, right? Because as Georgie said, most people left alone, they probably wouldn't get to that 80,000.
Yeah,
so it's totally worth it because you still got the 70,000 and not zero.
Yeah.
But you can see the impact of those fees. Yeah. But one thing I think we should touch on is the problem of hidden fees. I know, Neville, you have a whole list.
Certainly, yeah. No, I think it brings up a good point, is that I think any investor or client has the right and should be informed of what they're paying for and what they're getting. Because ultimately, and we just saw from Christoph's example, that let's say you're paying, it's unbeknownst to you, but under one scenario you're paying 2% fees, and then the other scenario, this is per annum, so every year, and then the other scenario you're getting the exact same level of service and paying effectively double, which has a huge impact on the portfolio over time.
Yeah.
Because those fees are compounding each year. And each year you're paying out that fee, it's not then compounding, getting back to the return perspective. So I think the industry itself has come a long way to become more transparent. However, I think there are still questions that clients need to ask to understand what is the value chain of fees,
that's
if you
the
will.
word value, that's the key bit. It's
Right.
what are you actually paying for?
Right, exactly.
Right? Because it's not necessarily the cost. It's not the cost of anything. It's the value you're getting from what you're paying, right? So you as the investor needs to be comfortable that they're getting value for what they're paying, right? And hopefully that value is multiples more than the cost. And that's the key. But yeah, as you say, Neville, the industry has become a lot more transparent. I think Cayman's still, unfortunately, maybe a little bit further behind in some of the regulations that have come into place in other parts of the world. Certainly, well, in the US they've tried, and in some places in the world, Australia and the UK, it's as an advisor you have to be a lot more transparent. So we'll just see how Cayman moves along that chain. And
certainly, and I think ultimately finding someone who you trust, and if you will, certainly from a CFA, if I put my CFA hat on, who acts as a fiduciary is ultimately important. And other than that being a somewhat convoluted, complex,
people don't know
funny
what
word,
that word means.
It effectively means that someone who's acting in your best interest at all times. So there's no inherent conflicts. They're not trying to sell you a product where they're getting kickbacks on the back end. They're making investment decisions for you on behalf of you as they would if it was their own money.
Yeah.
So
which should be assumed, right? But
which should be assumed, but there's a lot of situations that aren't as transparent or as clear cut as a client or customer would expect.
The way I think about fiduciary is I am the client, right? This is me. And so when I'm thinking about the client to make this decision, if this was me and all these factors about the client and who they are and where they are in life was me, what decision would I make?
Yep.
Right? So I have to put myself in their position. So I don't think, I wouldn't want someone to take some extra fee that's not worth the value. And I would want to make the best investment for myself. And so that's the mindset I have. And unfortunately, a lot of people are just not fiduciaries, but salespeople or brokers. So they're just, does a salesman have your best interest when they're selling you something? Maybe it's what's best for you.
Yeah, and I think the word trust is another really important thing to highlight, is finding someone that you trust. But the difference between being a fiduciary and not is huge. And again, there's no law here in Cayman, right? So people are always astonished to know that someone only has to give you something that's suitable, right? The suitability law, as opposed to something that's actually in your best interests, which is just, when you actually think that through, it can be suitable for you, but not in your best interest.
Well, think of a car, right? A suitable car will get you there, but the best car will be the best one for you. It's safe. It takes care of all the needs in the car. It's suitable. Well, did it drive?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but I think with anything, it doesn't matter what profession it is. It's if you understand how that person is compensated, and you understand what are their motives for selling you a certain thing, then you start to understand whether their interests are aligned with yours, which ultimately is what you want. You want your advisor or your investment manager or your counselor to benefit when you benefit. And I think that's important. Asking some of those questions oftentimes isn't the easy thing to do, because you might feel as though you're not as well educated, or they use big words, or there's a lot,
which is a really bad sign if they're throwing big words at you.
There's a lot of jargon in finance, and if some of these questions about fees become, catch them off guard or they hesitate, it's probably worth scratching the surface a little bit more on those.
If I could link back to the opening of our discussion, Christoph linked fees and time, that they work against us. But what about returns and fees? Is there any relationship between high fees and high returns, low fees and low returns? It's just an open question to the floor.
That's an excellent question.
Really good point,
because we think in most industries, you think, wow, if I pay for the premium service, I'll get the best service.
Yeah.
But studies have found in finance and
Exact
investing, it's the exact opposite. Morningstar did a study of all their funds, and they found that the best predictor of returns were the funds that had the lowest fee. The strategy didn't matter. All that mattered was choose the one with the lowest fee. Because you know what? It works against you. It's such a drag. It's like looking at a race, and everyone's lined up, and some of them have a weight attached to the ankle. Guess what? They're going to lose.
But Christoph, there's an important distinction there between the underlying fees within a fund and the performance of the fund versus the fee you might be paying to an advisor. Because, for example, Vanguard did their study that showed that actually people that work with that compassionate guide of an advisor actually do better, right? Even though they are paying fees. So there's that alpha
so
that
the
can be
distinction
added.
there is the first study I mentioned was on the funds themselves, and Georgie's referring to the advisor, the value of the advisor.
Yeah.
Because the fund fees doesn't really help you in your behaviors, right? The fund is just what it costs in terms of the investment. They're not talking to you and telling you when to buy or sell.
Or giving you advice on how to structure a portfolio.
Good point.
I think that's a great point, and it's hard to believe we're already out of time or getting close to being out of time. And I think so this show we've covered two of the topics. The original agenda called for 5. So
We knew we were never going to do it.
and we could probably continue on here as it's been a very fruitful and great discussion. So with that, on behalf of Money Sense and our listeners, I want to thank Georgie, Emile, and Christoph for this great discussion. And please join in 2 weeks. We're going to continue this investor guide. There's lots of great topics, including Emile's favorite, which is inflation. Also diversification. I don't know that we'll be going into Bitcoin, but we'll possibly be talking about gold. And impact and roles of advisors. So please join us again in 2 weeks, and thank you.
Money Sense is brought to you with the support of OneTradeX. OneTradeX, the Cayman Islands' #1 choice for online brokerage.